Hello, everybody. My name's Brian Berger, and I'm the editor of Space News. Thanks for joining us for today's webinar. This is Space News' third webinar this month and third webinar since the quarantine began. Today, we're going to be talking about the FCC and its role in setting space policy. They've made a number of decisions recently that affect the space industry, and there's more activity to come this summer. Before we launch into it, I just wanted to share a few housekeeping notes with everybody. We are going to take questions from the audience. We're going to carve out some time in order to put your questions to the panelists. In order to help us do that, I'd ask you to use the Q&A function that should be at the bottom of your screen. Use that, please, instead of the chat function. Because the Q&A just makes it a lot easier for us to sort through questions. Given the number of people we have on as attendees today, we won't be able to get to anywhere near all the questions. Keeping your questions short and to the point will also make it easier for me to go through them and tee them up for our panelists today. So once again, thank you for joining us. Without any further ado, I'm going to turn today's webinar over to our moderators, Caleb Henry and Jeff Foust. Jeff, why don't you take it from here?
Thanks, Brian, and welcome everybody to this webinar. As you probably know, the FCC has been playing a major role in some key issues related to space policy in recent weeks with its approval of Ligado's 5G system over objections from some in industry and government about concerns about GPS interference, as well as this work on orbital debris regulations, including a decision at its open meeting just last week to accept some changes but defer others for further study. So to start off with, I'd like to ask the panel, maybe either Jennifer or Carlos, maybe just give a recap of Ligado, where it stands, and how we got here, given that while it got a lot of attention in the last couple of weeks, this has been an ongoing issue actually for a number of years regarding its proposed system and the concerns about it.
Carlos, do you want me to take this, or do you want to take it and add in what I forget?
I think you should take the lead on this one, Jennifer. Thank you.
Okay, so, and hopefully you can add in. I'm sure I will leave some stuff. But, so Jeff, first, thanks for having us. We're excited to be here. The FCC's been very active, especially during the pandemic, you know, keeping us busy on things like orbital debris and the upcoming regulatory fee item and other things, the Viasat approval. But with regard to Ligado, this is a fairly long-term proceeding where Ligado and its predecessor, Light Squared, sought to get some additional flexibility on terrestrial use of the bands of the L-band, and this is the conventional MSS L-band. So there's about 66 megahertz of this spectrum that was divvied up, I want to say back in 1996 between Inmarsat, what was then the US licensee called American Mobile Satellite Corporation, and a company in Canada, I can't remember who it was in Canada at the time, and Mexico and Russia. There were 5 users of the band, and they segmented the band. And over the years, Ligado's predecessors worked with the other 5 parties to the agreement. There's an agreement called the Mexico City MOU to make it better available for MSS, but also better available for terrestrial. And that included an agreement with Inmarsat to be able to use a coordination agreement to use some of the spectrum for terrestrial, and they've been negotiating with the other parties. What's happened was, and I haven't personally been involved since I left the company back in the late 2000s, so late 2009 or so. So a lot of this I'm doing just from what I understand, so I apologize if I make any mistakes, but essentially they went and tried to get some additional flexibility. Some in the GPS community, both commercial and government, objected. And there was, I'd say, several years of studies that were done that are discussed in the record or included in the record. Some of them were confidential because they involved military systems, and a lot of discussions, not just between the parties to the coordination agreement, but more importantly in the FCC proceeding for approval. And the FCC reached and decided last week on a 5-0 basis to go ahead and allow Ligado to use 310 megahertz blocks of spectrum for for terrestrial use, basically ancillary terrestrial use is the FCC's term, and then also put in place a requirement that they have at least 6 megahertz of MSS spectrum, and also dedicated a 10 megahertz band for MSS, but at least 6 megahertz of that has to be used by Ligado. I'm not sure if it's actually that spectrum that has to be used, but that 6 megahertz, but that 10 megahertz block remains MSS only. And that's a block that has aeronautical safety in it. So they did agree to certain protections and certain conditions, and I don't have them as memorized as I should. Maybe Carlos knows them better, but it does let them go forward with putting out a terrestrial network. As part of that order, there were conditions imposed. They have to have commercial available satellite. There's an integration device requirement for a satellite terrestrial device that has to be available on the market. And some other requirements like that, as well as working with the incumbent GPS community if there's interference. So it's a fairly complex order. I think it's 160 or so pages. So it's quite full and was very contentious. And I think from, I would say from a satellite industry perspective, or from any licensee perspective, I think we're glad there was a decision, whatever the decision is. I don't have a dog in this fight, but I think we're happy to see companies getting certainty, and we think that's really important. So Carlos, I don't know what I've left off here.
Well, thanks very much, Jennifer. You've certainly given a comprehensive view of the FCC's action. As you suggested, there is quite a bit of history spanning a period of about 17 years in which, Light Squared, now Ligado, has evolved its proposal over time, initially suggesting a broadband terrestrial system at very high power levels. I believe initially it was something on the order of 42 dBW immediately adjacent to the GPS band. Over time, those power levels have been reduced to 9.8 dBW with a guard band separating it from GPS. So there's a significant reduction in the potential for interference into the adjacent band as a result, going from a broadband terrestrial system to a terrestrial IoT, much lower data rate, much lower power. Some of the conditions, as you suggested, included working with the GPS industry, extensive monitoring, and even replacement of equipment for government users, for example. I would add that there are space policy implications here for GPS operations, both consumer GPS equipment, Fitbits and the like, to high precision GPS and aviation related GPS equipment that can be viewed as a little bit different. The high precision government users, those types of equipments, those types of receivers may have better performance characteristics and are better able to withstand potential out-of-band interference from Ligado's operations, whereas some of the low-cost consumer GPS equipment may experience some difficulty and may indeed evolve over time, improve over time, to the extent that there is in fact interference that's experienced. I would end by suggesting that the space policy implications are there, but fundamentally this order is about assessment of spectrum sharing and interference impact of the Ligado system. And the FCC is uniquely qualified, is indeed the expert agency to address these issues, even to the extent there may be some differences of opinion or disagreement among US government agencies. This was an issue before the Commission for nearly 2 decades, and moving forward in its capacity as the licensing agency does seem clearly to be within its jurisdiction and mandate.
Let me ask another question here before turning it over to Caleb. What degree of interagency coordination was there? I mean, the Defense Department was very outspoken in its opposition to the plan, and a number of other agencies also spoke out. Was there coordination among the agencies? Should there have been coordination among that? Because I think it's unusual from a lot of people's standpoint to see such disagreement among government agencies about a proposal and agreement, licensing agreement like this.
And I'll certainly share a few thoughts, and Jennifer, you may have some thoughts as well. Clearly, there was interagency coordination and consultation over time. The changes to certain agency positions, may have occurred, and indeed, as the proposal continued to evolve, some differences and some questions were raised, and very much so at the 11th hour. At the end of the day, the FCC attempted to address some of those concerns with additional conditions that are included in the order that will require Ligado to continue to assess and address any potential interference going forward. But Jennifer, you may have some additional thoughts on the notion of interagency coordination on this.
And it's not so much interagency coordination on this, but interagency coordination overall. There's a 2003 memo between the chairman of the FCC and the head of NTIA that's been in effect so now 17, 18 years. And it requires that the chairman and the head of NTIA meet regularly, but also has an approach, very general. It's on the FCC's website. I'm sure it's on the NTIA's website, about coordinating. And this is an area that groups like the Commerce Spectrum Management Advisory Committee is looking at. Are there ways to improve the memo and this coordination? Should there be a different way to enable spectrum sharing? Does there need to be more research and development supporting FCC decisions, kind of from a broader context? So I think this brings it home. It is very hard to coordinate spectrum between agencies and the FCC. And the MOU today provides the framework, and maybe this is an opportunity to go back and say, should there be something else being done? And that really goes to the, we're waiting for the president's spectrum memo to come out. I think as part of the White House directive, there was a directive that there was supposed to be produced a spectrum, there was a Department of Commerce document that's supposed to set out the national spectrum strategy. And we're still waiting for that. So I think we're hopeful that maybe that will be addressed in there. But I think as an industry perspective, we'd like to see improved sharing and improved coordination between the government users and the FCC. And that's for a wide variety of bands, not just the L band.
Okay, I'll jump in. I had a follow-up question just on that, but also a little bit more broad perhaps. I'm curious if you think that the FCC was open enough with its decision-making on how it chose to approve Ligado's license modification. I think, Carlos, you mentioned there's a significant reduction in power level. There's also the guard band, like a 23 megahertz guard band. But because there have been so many complaints and because this is such a lengthy process, do those complaints stem from the fact that there's just not enough information out there about how this decision was made?
That's an interesting question. There's certainly enough information in the record of the proceeding. There have been an enormous number of studies. The FCC took some significant deep dives to address particular issues, for example, helicopter operations near airfields, things of that nature. So in the context of how they make the decision, they address and evaluate the record before them. There may still be concerns, and it's not to suggest that a potential review or even appeal of the decision couldn't or wouldn't be successful. But again, the FCC is the expert agency. It has reviewed a significant amount of information, and it has set up a series of conditions to continue to work with the licensee as well as potentially affected industry and government interests to ensure that interference is prevented in the future.
And do you think that for Ligado, they're close at all to being able to actually roll out their service, or is it more likely that this is something, the DoD has already voiced concerns again, Iridium has voiced concerns because they also use L-band for their satellite constellation. Do you think that this milestone actually means they'll be able to move forward, or that there's a lot more work ahead of them?
I think that there is a lot more work ahead of them. The FCC's licensing order is not the last word, but that work includes progress and moving forward. I can't speak to the specifics of potential implementation, but there are multiple years contemplated in the order in terms of actual deployment for Ligado.
Caleb, before we leave this topic, there's a question that comes in from a member of the audience, a well-informed member of the audience who is a former director of the NRO. And he points out that the risk for GPS interference is not in expensive receivers like those in cell phones. The risk is to high precision receivers like those in aircraft. And then he has a question that some of you may or may not be able to answer. What will happen if interference is experienced in safety of life situations? So I put that question out there. Is there anybody who would like to take a swing at that?
I can't certainly can't speak to the specific technical details that are being referenced here. Of course, safety of life services do need to be addressed. My understanding was that significant consideration was given to high precision GPS receivers, and that there in fact were agreements between and among Ligado and manufacturers of those types of receivers. Beyond that, there are unique circumstances in this particular band that will continue to be evaluated, but needless to say, safety of life services necessarily deserve the highest level of protection.
Thanks, Carlos. Back to you, Caleb, unless Jennifer wants to jump in on that. I'm seeing a head shake no, so Caleb, it's all yours.
Okay, thanks. I was going to ask a follow-up question, which is also going to shift us a little bit more into our next topic, which was about space debris and orbital debris rules. A question for anybody is, when it comes to U.S. space policy, we talked about interagency process a little bit already, but how does the FCC fit into the interagency process of shaping U.S. space policy?
Who would like to answer that, Caleb?
I've picked on Carlos a lot. I don't know if I can maybe jump to Jennifer or Moriba.
Sure, I can certainly speak to that. So the FCC is an independent regulatory agency, and it's a licensing agency. So I say first and foremost in the licensing process, and let me back up. I'm going to talk about kind of on the commercial satellite side, which is what I know best. But on the commercial satellite side, the FCC, unlike a lot of other countries, actually issues a license, not just for construction and operation of your satellite system, but also for launch. Most other countries, at least I'm familiar with, usually have a separate space agency that authorizes the launch. But because of the FCC's special role with the operation and the launch, they did back in, I want to say it was 2005, take the first steps to put in orbital debris mitigation rules. And what they did then was, it was really, there had been an international conference and there were certain international standards that were put in place. And the FCC really took those standards and made them a condition to licenses going forward. And whether they were right or wrong, we can argue over that, but they were using an expert agency's approach. The FCC is not an expert agency on what standards for orbital debris or space sustainability should be. But what they do have a very important role is, as the licensing agency, is to have an enforcement arm, putting conditions that you meet those requirements. In my view, is critical, and the FCC is the right agency to do it, but it has to be informed from other agencies. At the same time, we have the space directives, and this is where I think things get complicated. Is space directives set up certain groups, but the FCC can't necessarily be a member. For instance, they're not a member of the National Space Council. They're not a member of other interagency groups because they're not an executive branch agency. And so I think, though, the FCC, and has traditionally, when I was at the commission, my last go around, we used to meet with the expert agencies to understand what was going on and try and put them into our rules and into our licensing process. So I think that's the real answer, is the FCC's role is to take what the expert agencies do and be the implementator, the enforcer of making sure those rules are put in place. I don't know if that answers your question, but hopefully it gets to it a little bit.
It does, and I'll ask one more before shifting over to Jeff. You mentioned that the FCC is not part of the National Space Council. One commissioner, Jessica Rosenworcel, did complain about that. Should the FCC be part of the National Space Council, given how important commercial space has become to US space programs in general?
You know, it's a good question, but they are an independent regulatory agency. So, you know, it depends. They can't take direction under Communications Act or under law. They can't take direction at the White House. You know, the FCC does participate in some less formal interagency groups. But in terms of anything where they would take direction, I think that would be in violation of statute unless there was a statutory change. I don't know if Carlos would agree with me on that. And so interested in your view, Carlos, too.
Just to share a few additional words on that, you know, the FCC is certainly very much involved in these types of issues. My recollection is in SPD3, in the context of mitigating orbital debris, you know, NASA is to coordinate with a number of agencies and in consultation with the FCC, develop policies to mitigate orbital debris impacts. The draft order actually proposed to adopt a few requirements that seem to be at odds with US orbital debris policy. The FCC has moved those particular elements of the draft order into the further NPRM, and the basis upon which the FCC is adopting and implementing orbital debris policies is its general public interest mandate to authorize, you know, launch and operation of satellite systems consistent with the public interest, convenience, and necessity. That does encompass US orbital debris policy. The question becomes, is the FCC empowered to independently develop orbital debris policy that is otherwise not part of US consensus or coordinated policy? And in that context, when you're looking at a public interest assessment and a single coordinated US space policy, there is a real question as to whether the FCC can get out in front of US space policy or adopt requirements that may be considered inconsistent with US orbital debris policy.
I wanted to use this opportunity to bring in Mariba with his great expertise in orbital debris and space traffic management. There's a lot of opposition to the FCC draft regulations, particularly from industry, but also from some in Congress. Was the issue for you, if there was an issue for you, the content of the FCC rules or how it was developed, or whether the FCC is the agency that should be doing these regulations?
Yeah, no, thank you very much. Thanks for everybody attending. I think
Did Mariba just freeze for everybody?
Yeah.
All right. Let's give him a second to come back on. While we're waiting for that, this is a good line of inquiry. There's quite a few questions about the orbital debris decisions and what's to come. Questions, for example, about how the difference between the policy that was adopted in December will be squared with what the FCC has just done. Is there going to have to be any sort of adjudication? So hopefully we'll get Mariba back on. He can address that. Looks like he's probably going to try to relog on. Jeff, do you want to either direct that question to somebody else or ask a different question and give Mariba a chance to rejoin? I'll let you decide.
Yeah, the issue is that this FCC proceeding came up while there's still work ongoing to implement Space Policy Directive 2 to give Commerce Department more authority on this. They require legislation, for some of the authorities that they need for either Carlos or Jennifer, is is Commerce Department the right place to have this authority? What role should it have versus the FCC versus other agencies in doing orbital debris regulations?
I can start. So I have to be honest, I don't have, I don't think the FCC, so orbital debris regulations, to the extent they're being applied to commercial operators, should be done through the FCC is my view. That's the commercial licensing body. That makes sense. It's the development of the standards and what the policies are. And that needs to be done by an expert agency. If that expert agency is staffed appropriately, is that Commerce? Is that Department of Transportation? Is it FAA? Is it someone else? I don't know, but I think my strong view from an industry perspective is I want it to be an agency that has that authority, and I want it to be done in an open and transparent manner where we can participate. Then the FCC should take what's taken from that and use that as its conditions for licensing and implement that, but they shouldn't be making the policy. They don't have, there's no specific expertise. There's no group of people at the FCC you could turn to and say, these are experts on this. So thank you, Carlos. I don't know if you want to add to that.
Oh, I absolutely agree. As a fundamental matter, again, the FCC suggested that it's examining the issues in the context of its public interest analysis. And that would appear to entail considerations associated with consistency of proposed systems and operations with US policy. That's what they did in 2004 when they addressed orbital debris. And the disposal altitude for geostationary satellites. Interestingly, the formal US position was a specific altitude, but the FCC instead adopted the IADC formula that varied the disposal altitude based on the mass of the satellite at issue. But the US had already been moving down that path through the ITU process to adopt that new and improved standard. In the context of this decision and the draft order in particular, there were some significant and substantial disconnects between what the FCC was proposing and established US policy.
Looks like we got Mariva back. So we lost you just as you were starting to give your answers. So take it away.
Yeah, sorry about that. So yeah, Murphy's Law sort of thing. Yeah, so I guess the thing that I wanted to say is that this whole discussion reminds me a lot of the Spider-Man movie, something paraphrasing like with great power comes great responsibility sort of thing. And so I think the FCC, I agree with everything that Jennifer and Carlos said, needs to be a competent customer of sorts when it comes to this stuff. And when I read the document, the thing that pleased me about it was this kind of being visionary and trying to kind of see what the space traffic looked like in the future and genuine concern for public interest. The thing that I didn't like about it so much was just there's a lack of technical competency kind of behind some of this stuff, perhaps. It's not transparent to whatever extent it might be there. And I think that when the FCC, as an example, moves forward with these sorts of proposals, there should be a lot more in terms of data and assumptions that go behind making some of these claims on what the probability of collision needs to be, and like all these nuances, which, you know, our space domain is very nuanced. What really motivates this, and is the pool of information that was used as a basis for that available to a wider community to allow scientists and whomever be able to draw their own conclusions to see, do those opinions from independent assessment, are they consistent or inconsistent with the views in the document? And I think that's the thing that's pretty much in absentia and that I have the biggest problem with.
Yeah, what would you like to see the FCC do differently this next time around as they go back through this revised rulemaking process and seek new input?
Yeah, so one of the things I think that is the biggest concern to me is uncertainty, plain and simple. We have a lot of ignorance about how all these different moving parts come together You know, you have the Starlink satellites that have automated maneuvers, which a lot of people don't even have a chance to really comprehend what's behind that and how do you predict how these things are going to move. I mean, the bottom line is the space domain, if we want to get to this idea of safety, security, and sustainability, the domain itself needs to be transparent, it needs to be predictable, and we need to have a body of evidence by which we can hold people accountable for their behaviors in the domain. And I think moving forward, whatever the FCC does, it has to hit on that transparency, predictability, and accountability, and it needs to make it very clear how a greater community can actually weigh in on this. So whatever data, again, and whatever tools and assumptions are used, that I think needs to be vetted by independent organizations, entities, individuals, so that you can kind of aggregate all what's inferred and actually compare notes and see if there's an agreement, because the domain belongs to all of us, not just to, you know, a select few.
Can I speak? Can I add something in here? One of the things that I think was concerning to industry, well, there were a number of things, but was the subjectivity in the draft order. The FCC, I think there were 44 cases where things were left to staff. And that creates tremendous uncertainty, and it's something we've seen in the FCC's implementation in other areas in the satellite regulation, is that space is seen as something different, and I'm really not sure it's all that much different than any of the other spectrum-based uses, but that the staff has so much discretion that you don't even know what to come in with. You know, if the draft order had been adopted. I'd say the other two areas I do want to touch on, which maybe are a little more, not so much space sustainability, but ways to get there. And that was the proposed indemnification scheme and the post-mission disposal bond. The FCC in the original draft order had an unlimited indemnification requirement for satellite operators, where you basically would have said, I'll indemnify you for any damage that goes on. I don't know how that's implementable. And we're very happy to see that move to the notice. I don't think we're against indemnifying the United States for damages if caused by, you know, an operator, but you want to know what that is, what that looks like, what you're committing to. And then secondly, the post-mission disposal bonds, sorry, I always reverse those. You know, as the draft notice was originally written, it pretty much said it was pretty much a tentative conclusion. This is what we're doing. And there's never, at least on the geo side, which is where my company is mostly focused, there's really been no issue that we could find where a geostationary operator didn't dispose of the space object, you know, in accordance with the requirements. So it seemed that there wasn't really a real need for that, at least as broad a need. And so we were very happy that the FCC moved indemnification to the notice and also extended questions on those two things. But it really goes down to this predictability, certainty. We need to know what we need to do to meet those rules. And I think that's going to be an important part of this being a successful order in the next round.
And if it's possible to share a few additional thoughts, I again concur with what Jennifer has highlighted. In addition, we have to first accept and understand that industry is very much committed to space sustainability. Responsible access to space is essential. And ensuring that we're approaching it in the right way is also a very important consideration, because not only space policy, but other important US public interest issues are implicated by the FCC's decisions here. For example, the potential application of single satellite criteria to entire systems of NGSO constellations, regardless of size, can be very problematic, since the single satellite criteria, of course, are designed for one spacecraft, and it may be extraordinarily difficult for constellations of hundreds or thousands of satellites to attempt to or be required to comply with those single satellite metrics. The FCC in that context has to ensure that, you know, it is continuing to promote US leadership in space, innovation in new space, and indeed broadband policy and bridging the digital divide with the satellite system proposals that are currently before it. One thing we certainly don't want to do is to have FCC orbital debris policy close the door on new systems and services that can bring significant benefits to the US public and the entire world.
Caleb, do you have some questions?
I do. I had a question actually about what's been discussed so far has been a lot about the subjectivity. I think one concern that's been brought up since the rules came out was that if the FCC required a threshold as high, as you said, as applying a collision risk, and it was 1 in 1,000 for an entire constellation, be it 300 satellites or 3,000 satellites, that could encourage companies or operators to come up with fairly lenient algorithms for calculating their collision risk. So they could perhaps come to the FCC and say, of course it has a low collision risk, but there might not be a standardized way of actually calculating that. Mariba, you're nodding your head.
Yeah, so here's the thing, right? One of the things that I've said time and time again is collision of probability in and of itself is a completely nonsensical measure of coming up with collision risk. Because the thing is, it's one number. It's one number that tries to encapsulate so many different things and assumptions that are kind of, you know, left to the reader to just kind of lay back in a hammock and kind of assume or dream up what went into that. That's the thing that I have the biggest issue with, is that people keep on talking about this collision probability as if like all collision probabilities are made equal. They're not. Like you said, the algorithms, you could take the same data, the same sensor measurements, absolutely identical, and give it to 4 different people, and you're going to come up with 4 different collision probabilities. Just because the physics that they assume when they process the data are different, just because some assumptions on maybe the shape and material properties of the object and all these things. So it's very nuanced. Like collision probability can be part of the answer, but it can't be the thing that people hang their hat on because it's a very subjectively computed sort of thing. We don't have a standard for how we calculate collision risk. There is no global standard for that. That's a major issue. And so again, so I agree with that completely. Like that needs to be scrubbed. It needs to be socialized. A global community needs to come up with that. It can't just be the IADC, because that's all governments. It needs to be research institutions. It needs to be a bunch of different organizations that come together and say, if we could come up with what the standard would be for collision risk, which is, you know, some sort of, you know, variable that has multiple facets to it, what could that kind of look like? And I would say, you know, the World Economic Forum, they're working on this space sustainability rating that takes some of this stuff into account, right? The European Space Agency has an index that kind of is something like a space traffic footprint that I've been trying to develop as well. There's an idea of what orbital capacity is. Like all these things need to be factored into the risk of a collision, not just collision probability.
Carlos, do you have thoughts on that? I see you have your mic off.
Certainly to share some additional thoughts and to underscore the issues that Mariba just raised. You know, there are some differences of opinion about calculation approaches, analytical approaches. You know, notwithstanding reference to NASA's DAS software, the real question, and to the extent there's a major upside to the FCC's including these issues in the FNPRM for additional comment and discussion for interested parties, that is the notion of how do you address NGSO systems and systems of potentially great size, again, hundreds and thousands. They may need to have different criteria than individual spacecraft, the metrics that are currently in place. So having that discussion is obviously very productive. However, ensuring that whatever is happening on this track, the further notice of proposed rulemaking at the FCC, goes in parallel with other efforts, be they congressional efforts international efforts, interagency efforts in the United States. We would still caution independent, unilateral establishment of new standards, particularly in the context and under the guise of a public interest assessment for satellite system licensing.
One additional thing that I want to say to what Carlos brought up that is also kind of detrimental to us moving forward is the fact that there is no scientific taxonomy for human-made objects in space. You know, the US Spacecom catalog treats everything as cannonballs. They're all spheres. Things that are like a school bus are like the same thing as a CubeSat. That's ridiculous. That makes no sense whatsoever, right? So oil tankers on the ocean get treated differently than kayaks, right? Semi-trucks on our roads are differently treated than Vespa scooters. Why in the hell would we treat everything in space like it's one and the same? So that makes no sense whatsoever. There's got to be an effort that derives, again, as a community, a standard, comes up with a taxonomy of human-made objects in space that says, here are the different classes and species of stuff. This is how they behave in different orbital habitats. And this is how we should regulate this stuff because these things pose different risks, actually. You know, it's not Lord of the Rings, one ring to rule them all. That makes no sense. So we need to get away from that kind of mentality.
Yeah, I just wanted to circle back to something we were talking about a little earlier and see if we've got any more input on it. Is, you know, we have a space traffic management policy, Space Policy Directive 3. Where does the FCC fit in? Simply as an implementer, or should they have a seat at the table in helping craft some of these regulations they're going to be charged to implement? Because right now they're pretty much crafting the regulations on their own in the absence of broader implementation of the policy. Is the FCC should be helping craft these, or should they just be standing by for someone else to craft them and then just roll them into their policies?
So I actually have an opinion on this. One of the best organizations that I worked for back in the day was JPL, and it's a truly matrix organization. You had line elements and you had program elements. I would say with SPD3, it says there, Commerce takes the lead. Sure, Commerce can be the program manager for this stuff, but you need skills, expertise, and capabilities from many, many different agencies that could be viewed as the line elements that make all this stuff close. So yeah, absolutely, the FCC should be one line element in the national, you know, space traffic management SSA consortium kind of moving forward.
Yeah, and it's Jennifer, I would actually, I would agree with that. I think they have to be at the table because they are the ones who are going to have to implement this for the commercial industry. And they're going to have a view of how licensing works and how this fits overall. So I think it is critical. And I also think it's going to be important, you know, at some point, I want to go back. I think Carlos brought up the international aspect. None of this is successful at the end of the day, unless at some point there's international buy-in to what we're trying to do. The US cannot be, even though we're a major space power, cannot just be saying, this is it. And I think one of the areas where the FCC is very good is working with its colleagues and international bodies and getting buy-in on the regulated licensing sides. So I think it's very important to have them have a seat at the table.
And just to put a final point on it, that particular issue, notwithstanding the Commerce's role in space traffic management and information sharing and in otherwise in this area, SPD3 does specifically call out, you know, NASA's in the lead on developing new guidelines for design and operation of satellite systems in coordination with state defense, transportation, commerce, et cetera, and in consultation with the FCC. Clearly they have a role, clearly they have a seat at the table, but the notion of moving out in front of US orbital debris policy in this way is potentially concerning.
Okay, I think we've got about 15 minutes left. Brian, do you want to tee up any of the audience questions that we've gotten?
Absolutely. Thanks, Caleb. And good conversation, everybody. I'm seeing some questions from our attendees about the disposal bond issue. in the FCC's proposed rules. I don't think we've discussed that too much yet today. Jeff, yay or nay?
I think Jennifer mentioned it in discussion a little while earlier, and I think some of the concerns about how that would be implemented.
Sure, and you discussed the indemnity too. Did we get to industry's concern about what this could actually cost satellite operators? What kind of market function might emerge to actually make these bonds possible? Jennifer, if you haven't addressed that, could you hit on that again for us?
Yeah, and then maybe Carlos can help me with some of the smaller, because he certainly knows the smaller folks. So, I still go to the fact is it even necessary, at least for geo operators? But we already do have a bond requirement. First off, let me start out. The FCC is the only country in the world that has ever put in place, a regulator has put in place a bond requirement that I've ever seen, and I work quite a bit internationally. So today, for instance, we have $3 million bond requirements for GSO applications, licenses, and $5 million bond requirements for NGSOs. And the market depends on how you get those bonds. Are you, and Carlos can add on here, are you a big operator, a company like EchoStar Hughes or Viasat or Intelsat, or are you a smaller operator? So for the larger companies like ours, we get a bond, we pay a fee every year to keep up that bond. But they're very low value bonds. Now, if the bonds went up to $100 million, I don't even know what that would cost. I can't even imagine. And it's 15 years or more for that bond to be in place. So let's just say, even for a company like mine, let's say it costs several $100,000, and I'm making this up because I don't know what the real cost is, but we are talking probably something in those realms. That's a huge amount of money to take away from a company that could be doing something with it that's more innovative, have a better use, to just sit there, especially when there's no reason proven. There was nothing in the notice really what this was there to, what they're trying to do here. So I think there is a big financial impact here. This is my concern with the licensing bonds as well. These are being imposed on both small and large companies, as a way to achieve a public interest goal that I'm not sure is really a problem. So, but Carlos, maybe you can talk a little bit about the smaller satellite operators, because I know it's a pretty significant burden on them as well.
Exactly, disproportionately so, because unlike large established satellite operators who have extensive assets and credit histories, small startups, new space companies are unable to get a bond or some kind of credit facility to support the bond, as Jennifer just described, in the amounts of a couple of $100,000 per year, which is real money. Instead, these small companies with no credit histories essentially have to take the amount of the bond in cash and deposit it in an account to support a letter of credit, because it's not possible for them to get a pay-as-you-go bond. Tying up that amount of capital for a startup can really dampen space and satellite innovation.
I'd like to go back to indemnification. If I could, Brian, can I just touch
Sure.
on indemnification? Because I think there was a similar concern. What was most surprising about seeing the indemnification in the draft order was there was not a single party on the record who supported it. And it was a very short, if you go back to the draft order, it was several paragraphs, but there again, the FCC's idea was you would sign something when you got your license that you were willing to indemnify the United States. There again, there was no monetary value. Here, there was no monetary value ascribed, but how do you account for that? How do you I don't even know how you disclose it from if you're a public company. So once again, it wasn't, in my view, very, very well thought out of how that would be implemented.
What scenario is that even aimed at, Jennifer? What are we talking about here? We're talking about a commercial satellite registered to the United States, licensed under the United States. During its reentry, it causes some harm on the ground, right? It damages property, it damages people. So what's the scenario we're talking about here? Somebody's suing the US government for damages?
Yeah, but we would have to indemnify. And most countries, yeah, there are a number of countries that require operators to get, payload operators to get insurance, which is another way you can handle this, right? And there's a cost with that, but at least it's a sum certain. And I think that's what was missing. And it almost seems like the FCC was trying to avoid the insurance requirement. And maybe they even thought this was a lighter requirement but from a business perspective, it was so unknown. I think it ended up being more burdensome. And I think it was appropriate to put in the notice, especially once again, there wasn't a big problem here that was identified or a real problem identified.
Right. So the bonds are meant to incentivize operators to properly dispose of the satellites at the end of their service life, assuming that they can, right? Assuming that they can put them into a graveyard orbit or actively deorbit them. If they can't, is this bond money available to pay for active debris removal services? Anybody know? And if it's not, is there a potential to maybe reshape this idea that the FCC has and use this as some sort of fund to pay for active debris removal? Maybe Mariba, you have some thoughts about that, because there's systems out there now where they're being tested, they're in development, but who's going to pay for them?
Yeah. So one of the things that I'd like to go to with this whole thing is, you can't manage what you don't know, and you don't know what you don't measure. And so, Joe's disposal process might be different than Tanya's in terms of how far along that process they go. I mean, things that are fully disposed of, quote unquote, properly, just because something's in the right orbit doesn't mean that they passivated the stuff, doesn't mean that they folded, the solar panels and did all this other stuff that are part of the guidelines. It's almost anybody's guess as to what they did along that process. So we don't even have a way to monitor the compliance or lack thereof with who's following this stuff and to what level of granularity that's being followed. So to me, all this stuff about we're going to have this pile of money and do this and that with it is a bit premature, given that we don't even have the science that can properly say, hey, this is what the full disposal kind of thing looks like. Maybe it's a menu, right? Maybe once you have that measuring system, you can say, just like you go to a restaurant, you see, here are the entrees. You achieved this much. Well, this is how much of a penalty this, that, or the other comes along with that. Oh, you're only able to achieve this, that, and the other. We need that level of granularity. It needs to be surgical. But again, in order for the surgery to be able to happen, we actually need to have independently corroborated, very rigorous methods of reconciling who did what, when, and to what extent. And I feel that we're so far from that. People just want to be way out in front of the headlights on this.
Mariba, one of the members of our audience has a good question to that point. Does the FCC actively monitor and measure compliance, or do they rely on reports from elsewhere, such as public users, industry? They get tipped off by the Space Force?
Yeah, so I would say that they probably try to gather information from elsewhere. I don't know that the FCC has its own sensor network to make all these measurements, and it's probably not a good use of their time or resources. But I'll say this, right? Bringing in multi-source information into a common place to try to sort all that stuff out is non-trivial. Different opinions have different ways of calibrating stuff, have different confirmation biases embedded in all that. So to me, I think planet Earth writ large gets an epic F grade as a faculty member, going to say F, on bringing in multi-source information and figuring all this stuff out. In other domains, you can actually do quite well. Big data science analytics works well in social media, all these other domains. But for understanding space, it's a big F so far.
Thanks, Mariba. Jeff, there's a lot of questions from the audience, but we're coming up on the top of the hour. What would you like to return to or hit on before we begin to close this out?
I think this would be a good opportunity to see, since we've focused the hour primarily on Ligado and the orbital debris, if people, if any of our panelists want to weigh in on other space-related issues that are going to be on the FCC's radar in the months to come that our viewers should be aware of, whether it's C-band auction or May constellations or other activities, things that people should be keeping an eye on that the FCC is going to be dealing with in the near future.
Yeah, I guess the only thing that I can say that I noticed in the document, which I think people are going to start trying to poke more holes in, is this idea of trackability. What does that even mean? To say that an object's trackable and all this other stuff, or uniquely identifiable, right? Like, is that based on whose resources? Who's the observer? To, again, if you want to know something, you got to measure it. So what's the measurement system that is going to be defined as a standard to say, given an object of this size, of this class, of this species, and this type of a sensor, yes, trackability is going to be based on these things. Like, that's nowhere is that defined, you know? So I think that to me is something that needs to be critically addressed.
Thank you. Jennifer?
Sure. So some things that are probably pretty well known, and then maybe something, a thought piece. But first, regulatory fees is coming up on the Commission's open meeting, and that is interesting. For the first time, the FCC has concluded that they should impose regulatory fees. Those are the FCC's annual fees on foreign satellite operators, and also rebalance the fees between GEOs and non-GEOs. Things I'm very supportive of as a US operator and as a GSO operator. In addition, the FCC has its NGSO ESIM, or Stations in Motions item coming up. So that's a big one. We've also got an NGSO filing round for KUKA, and this is somewhat unusual. It's a second processing round. I can't think in recent memories of a second processing round for satellites. This is the band that excuse me, Ligado and SpaceX and Amazon's been waiting to get into. So it'll be interesting. That's at the end of May. It'll be interesting to see who shows up. I'm very sorry. And then finally, I think folks really have to start thinking what happens to the WRC. You know, we have a number of important satellite items coming up. Meetings are either going short and virtual right now or not happening at all. You know, right now we have some one day meetings coming up, 1 or 2 day meetings. You know, can the WRC keep its date? The head of the BR said yesterday on a webinar that they're not going to change the WRC date. But if folks are still not traveling, and by the end of the year, can you really produce the studies and really do the sort of work that's needed? So I do think that's something that the industry has to start focusing on and being you know, concerned about, not just our industry, but all the industries that use spectrum.
Just to jump in there briefly, Jennifer, are you saying that the coronavirus delays that are happening right now might delay the World Radio Communication Conference in 2023?
Yes, because the part of the reason we've gone back and forth on how long a space you need. Sorry, didn't mean to, but how long a time frame you need to study a WRC, and we had 2 years at one point. That was a failure. 3 years, so it really seems 3 to 4 years. We were supposed to have a series of meetings, so usually the study groups meet twice a year. This spring study group session for this, what I consider the really important groups for satellite, things like Working Party 4, important groups for terrestrial, Working Party 5, have either been condensed to 1 or 2 days. Working Party 5D had 1 meeting. They're still scheduled for a July meeting. It's highly unlikely they'll happen. If this continues into October, it's very hard to run a very dynamic meeting, which are what these 10-day study group cycle meetings are, on virtually. I mean, I don't even know how you can do it. I know some of the study groups have tried and have had some success, but they're not as large or as perhaps contentious as some of these. So I still believe there is a chance that the WRC will be moved.
As we come to the end here, I would like, Caleb, is there anything we need to mention about the C-band auction? It seems like there's some decision points coming up this summer that could shape how the auction proceeds this year.
Do you want to address that, Caleb? Do you want to call in one of our panelists before we let them go?
Sure, I can talk about it briefly, and then I think, Carlos, I believe you're familiar with some of the C-band activity as well, but in late May, the FCC set a deadline whereby Intelsat and SES have to decide whether or not they're going to participate in the Accelerated Clearing Program, which is the $9.7 billion fund, or maybe not fund, but $9.7 billion that the FCC has said it would make available for operators if they can clear out the spectrum 2 years faster. I'm blanking on the exact dates, but I think it's the end of 2023, December 2023, instead of December 2025. So far, SES has been really encouraged by the rule. Intelsat has yet to make a decision, and what those two operators decide on, since they cover the majority of US C-band satellite operations, will have ramifications for Eutelsat, Telesat, and Star One, the other three operators that have proven to the FCC they have C-band customers in the US. So that decision will be coming up then. The FCC also did recently put out an inquiry for some more information on whether or not they have the cost estimates right for replacement infrastructure for satellites and consolidating teleports and things of that nature. I didn't see a great deal about that, just they wanted to make sure their numbers were right. It didn't look like it was going to change the auction date. But Carlos, if you've seen anything more than that, I'd be happy to hear.
Just to say a few words, I think your dates are effectively correct, whether it's December or September of 23, 25. The issue of the major C-band satellite operators agreeing to an accelerated transition timeframe in exchange for acceleration payments is a key issue in terms of going forward. There's certainly work going on in the proceeding as contemplated in the FCC's order. The interesting question will be whether the COVID-19 situation will impact some of those near-term milestones, including the date for the auction. I certainly wouldn't want to speculate that anything would change, but it's something to keep an eye on.
Thanks, Carlos. Jeff, do you have any closing thoughts before we button this one up for today?
No, I think we've just had a really good discussion. I want to thank everybody for participating. I think we really touched on a lot of interesting, timely topics regarding the role of the FCC in space policy and some of the implications that it has both for the recent decisions and for the long term. So thanks for everybody for participating.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. Thanks, Caleb. Thanks, Mariva, Jennifer, and Carlos. We are going to have a replay of this available on our website later this afternoon. We were live streaming to YouTube. I'm not exactly sure how that's going to work. They may actually beat us. Our page on YouTube might actually beat SpaceNews.com in terms of having the archive available for replay. But we'll make sure we get that out to everybody. Once again, thanks to everybody who participated. We'll see you at our next webinar. Thanks very much.